The overnight period between January 19th and 20th was a night like many others that Ukraine has experienced over the last 4 years. Russian drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles came flying toward Ukrainian cities, but this time, something was different. Russia's overwhelming aerial assault proved to be anything but, as Ukraine mounted a defense unlike any seen so far in the war. Russia tried to break through Ukraine's defenses and slammed into a wall, but how did this massive air defense victory happen? We'll give you the answers later in the video. First, let's cover what Ukraine managed to pull off on the night in question. On January 20th, the Kyiv Post published an article that gave us the headline figures. Russia launched what amounted to its fifth major mass strike against Ukraine's heating infrastructure and power grid. The strike was enormous. 373 attack weapons were involved, including some major hitters that, if they touched down, could cause huge amounts of damage. The Shahid-type drone swarm seen so many times before was in full effect, as Russia launched 339 of its long-range attack drones at Ukraine. On the cruise missile front, Russia launched 15 projectiles, most of which are believed to be the low-flying Kh-101. However, strangely, Russia also deployed a single Zircon anti-ship missile. A mistake, perhaps. Or a sign that Russia might just be running low on cruise missile stockpiles. We'll confront those questions later in the video. Among these cruise missiles and drones were also 18 ballistic missiles, which the Kyiv Post says may be the Iskander-M or Iskander-S-300 missile. If they were Iskander-Ms, then Russia launched missiles that the Missile Defense Advocacy Alliance, or MDAA, claims can travel between 400 and 500 kilometers, or 248 and 310.6 miles, while delivering a conventional warhead that weighs up to 700 kilograms, or about 1,543 pounds. That's a heavy warhead delivered by a missile that the MDAA says may be able to travel at speeds of Mach 6 or 7. Iskander-Ms hit heavy and move fast. They should be an impossible weapon for Ukraine to take out of the skies, meaning we should be reporting on a strike that devastated Ukraine's major cities and left hundreds of thousands of people without heat, water, and electricity. But that's not what we're reporting. And the reason why is that Ukraine mounted a stellar defense during 6 hours of engagements in the airspace over central and northern parts of the country. That defense destroyed the vast majority of what Russia launched during the night of January 19th and into the early hours of January 20th. All told, Ukraine managed to destroy 342 of the 373 projectiles that Russia launched. Of course, that alone might not seem like a headline figure. 342 projectiles downed could easily translate into all of Russia's drones and 3 of its missiles destroyed, leaving the rest of the cruise and ballistic missiles to wreak havoc on a scale that a Shahid-type drone isn't capable of. But here's where everything seems to have changed for Ukraine. According to the Kyiv Post, Ukraine managed to shoot down 14 of the 18 ballistic missiles that Russia launched. It can't be overstated how much of an impressive achievement that 77% shoot-down rate is, especially given that Ukraine's air defenses have been somewhat struggling to deal with Russia's hypersonic weapons as of late. There's a reason why Ukraine managed to destroy so many of Russia's ballistic missiles, as we'll reveal soon. On the cruise missile front, Ukraine managed to take out 13 of the 15 that Russia fired, achieving a shoot-down rate of 86%. As for the drones, Ukraine managed to take out 315 Shahid types that, though dangerous, aren't capable of doing quite as much damage as Russia's missiles. Russia's drones and missiles ran into a brick wall on January 19th and 20th, and that means that Putin and his cronies have to deal with a very different Ukrainian defense from now on. As Professor Darren Gerdes of the Professor Gerdes Explains YouTube channel explains, the ballistic missiles are usually what get them. That's because they lack the air defense system to be able to do it, Gerdes says of Ukraine's usual fortunes with ballistic missiles in a comment that also hints at the big change that has happened for Ukraine. Indeed, as the Kyiv Post points out, an attack from earlier in 2026 highlights how Ukraine has fared with Russia's ballistic missiles in recent memory. On the night of January 12th and into January 13th, Russia rained 18 ballistic missiles down on Ukraine's homes and businesses. This attack, which took place about a week before the most recent strike, had very different results. Ukraine only managed to shoot down 2 of Russia's ballistic missiles, achieving a shoot-down rate of just 11% in the process. It didn't go the way it went before because they actually had air defense in order to defend themselves, and that's the big headline today, Gerdes said, and he's right. Something has changed with Ukraine's air defenses, and it's that the country finally has what it needs to tackle Russia's ballistic missiles. Before we get to that, it's important to note that 342 out of 373 projectiles shot down isn't a perfect interception rate. It's a 92% rate, according to Professor Gerdes, and that is extremely impressive. However, some of Russia's projectiles managed to sneak through, and they caused some damage. The Kyiv Independent has a report on what Russia managed to achieve, noting that the overnight attack saw it launch drones and missiles at Kyiv, Rivne, Odessa, Poltava, Kharkiv, and Zaporizhia. Almost all targeted civilian or other critical infrastructure, the outlet says. Unfortunately, a 50-year-old man was killed in the Kyiv attacks, with another person being injured. In Dnipro, the outlet reports a further 2 people, both women and senior citizens, were injured in the overnight attacks. Also in Kyiv, the outlet says 5,635 buildings remain without heating, which amounts to around 46% of the city's housing stock. However, if Russia's goal was to take out more of Ukraine's energy infrastructure on January 19th and 20th, then it didn't succeed. As Professor Gerdes points out, 80% of the buildings were buildings that Russia had already left without heating during a previous attack. Gerdes says, while noting that Russia did manage to leave the left bank of Kyiv without water in addition to causing civilian casualties. All of this is tragic, and is part of a psychological campaign that Putin is waging against Ukraine's people. But without the massive change in Ukraine's air defense posture that we saw during this latest attack, it could have been a whole lot worse. That brings us back to what we mentioned before about what the change is and why it proved so important. It's simple, and Gerd has hinted at it before. Ukraine actually has the air defenses it needs to tackle Russia's ballistic missiles. And those defenses arrived just in the nick of time, as the Kyiv Post also reported on January 20th. It says that Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky confirmed that the country had received a shipment of desperately needed air defense missiles just a day before Russia launched its overnight attack, and it was those air defense missiles that allowed Ukraine to destroy so many of Russia's ballistic missiles. A day before this strike, we finally received the necessary missiles, and this helped significantly. Every support package matters. Missiles for Patriots, NASAMS, and other air defense systems are critically needed, Zelensky reported. It seems likely that Ukraine received PAC-3 Patriot missiles, based on the Kyiv Post's reporting that only US Patriot air defense systems firing these specific types of missiles have proven themselves in battle to be able to take down ballistic missiles. This is hardly the most complicated logic in the world to follow. The more air defense weapons Ukraine has that are designed to destroy Russia's ballistic missiles, the more of those assaults will fail to find their targets when Russia launches its massive aerial assaults. If ever Zelensky needed a statistic to back up the point he often reiterates when Ukraine needs more Western air defenses, the massive uptick in interception of Russian ballistic missiles between the attack on January 19th and 20th and the strike Russia launched a couple of days before should be more than enough to prove that he's right. So a last-minute shipment of interceptor missiles made the difference for Ukraine during Russia's strike, but there's a little more to it than that. On top of these missile deliveries, Ukraine has also been expanding its air defense coverage with the help of its Western allies. Perhaps most tellingly, January 1st brought with it a report by the Kyiv Independent that Ukraine had deployed an additional 2 Patriot air defense systems due to a $1.4 billion deal with Germany that also guarantees long-term support and spare parts for those Patriot systems. The Kyiv Independent's report on this arrival notes that the Patriot has proven itself capable of shooting down Kinzhal and Zircon hypersonic missiles. We can add Iskander missiles to that list based on what we saw overnight. Patriot missile systems can also track 100 targets simultaneously and engage up to 8 at once, making them the most effective air defense systems that Ukraine has for dealing with Russia's missile threat. Nobody can say for certain that either of these 2 new systems shot down some of Russia's ballistic missiles on the night of January 19th, but it seems likely. More Patriots means greater coverage, and when those air defense systems have healthy supplies of the missiles that Ukraine needs to destroy Russia's ballistic missiles, you get an outcome like the one that we now see. Of course, Ukraine will always need and want more Patriots and missiles. In a perfect world, it will have enough of these systems to provide coverage for all of Ukraine. In the past, Zelensky has called for Ukraine's Western allies to provide 25 Patriot systems, presumably because he believes that is the number that Ukraine needs to cover the country's skies. Ukraine doesn't have 25 Patriots. It had 6 fully operational systems in April 2025, so the 2 added in January bring Ukraine's total up to 8. That covers about a third of Ukraine, and it seems enough to protect the country's major cities. Work is still needed to get Patriots into Ukraine, but the country has just demonstrated how well it can use the systems that it has. Interestingly, these Patriot systems may be set to become part of a new Ukrainian air defense system that Zelensky announced on the day of Russia's halted overnight assault. On January 19th, Reuters said that the Ukrainian armed forces were introducing a new facet to its air defenses in the form of interceptor drones. These drones will be added to Ukraine's other short-range assets, as Zelensky explains. There will be a new approach to the use of air defenses by the Air Force concerning mobile fire groups, interceptor drones, and other short-range air defense assets. Zelensky said during one of his nightly addresses, adding, "The system will be transformed." We may have seen this new system come into play on January 19th and 20th, especially as Zelensky suggested that Russia was preparing for a major strike during his address. If it did, then Ukraine's new air defense strategy seems simple enough to work out. Deploying interceptor drones and other mobile systems en masse ensures that as many of Russia's attack drones are taken out as possible. Throw electronic warfare systems into the mix, and you have a solid short-range wall of defenses. With drones being handled by these short-range defenses, Ukraine's intermediate and long-range air defense systems, including its Patriots, can focus solely on the missiles that Russia fires. One part of the system relieves the burden placed on the other and vice versa, to create more efficient layers of defenses that can take out the majority of what Russia fires at Ukraine. And those defenses are going to be needed. Because what we've seen from Russia during 2025 and the early stages of 26 is that airstrikes are going to continue playing a massive role in Putin's planning. According to the Kyiv Post, Putin has previously claimed that he wishes no harm to Ukraine's civilians. However, that claim doesn't hold up to scrutiny when you consider the fact that Russia has not only constantly attacked Ukraine's cities and civilian infrastructure since Putin launched his invasion, but those attacks have grown more intense as the years have gone on. 2025 was the worst year when it comes to the sheer numbers of drones and missiles that Russia launched into Ukraine. On December 31st, the Ukrainian Review offered some numbers, noting that Russia sent over 100,000 drones and about 2,400 missiles into Ukraine last year. That's in addition to about 60,000 guided bombs. The Kyiv Post roughly agrees with these figures. It makes the distinction between Russia's attack drones and the many decoy drones that the country sends to come up with a rough figure of between 50,000 and 55,000 attack drones launched into Ukraine. On the missile front, the outlet says that Russia fired between 1,000 and 1,500 cruise missiles, along with between 500 and 800 ballistic missiles. The point here is that scale is as much of an issue as the weapons used. As 2025 drew to a close, Russia had one of the most intense months yet in terms of the numbers of drones and missiles it launched. That's according to the UK government's travel advisory webpage for Ukraine. It says that the period between September and December 2025 saw Russia launch an average of 5,200 missiles and drones monthly. That represented a marked increase from the 3,900 launched in February 2025, and a more than quintupling of the 1,000 projectiles Russia fired at Ukraine in August 2024. Given the scale of these strikes, it's clear why Ukraine needed to level up its air defense game. That leveling up is now coming by way of a combination of a new short-range strategy and the arrival of much-needed missiles. However, it's not just what Russia is sending into Ukraine's skies that Zelensky and company need to worry about. It's what all of these missiles and drones are trying to hit. Ukraine's energy infrastructure has been a major target for Russia throughout much of the winter of 2025 and 26. By January 16th, Al Jazeera was reporting that Ukraine's energy minister, Denis Shmyhal, had claimed that there was not a single power plant left in Ukraine that the enemy has not attacked. Some of Ukraine's winter preparations had also failed, Shmyhal said, adding that the energy ministry estimates that the country has about 20 days of fuel reserves left. Also speaking about these attacks, the United Nations Under-Secretary General for Political and Peace-Building Affairs, Rosemary DiCarlo, added that there's a specific segment of people that Putin is targeting with his assaults on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. The impact of these attacks is felt hardest by the most vulnerable, the elderly, children, and persons with limited mobility, DiCarlo said. Stick with us and we'll come back to that point in a moment. Professor Gerdes adds that many in Russia are calling for Russia's already terrible attacks to be intensified. Gerdes claims that Russian military telegram channels are now calling for airstrikes on Ukraine's nuclear power plants, which is an approach so horrific that it would have to be considered a last resort if Russia wants to have any of Ukraine to claim once the war is over. According to Gerdes, some of these telegram channels are calling the strikes we're seeing now half measures. Why would they say that such strikes look like half measures? Gerdes asks before answering his own question. It's because Ukraine will never be fully de-energized because of the nuclear power plants. Nuclear catastrophe will be the result of such an approach. But all of this may simply be an extension of the terror tactics that Russia has been using against Ukraine for years now. A moment ago we mentioned that we would come back to DiCarlo's comments about Russia targeting the elderly along with children and persons with limited mobility. Gerdes agrees with this point, noting that Russia's strikes against Ukraine's energy infrastructure disproportionately target elderly people and children. They almost have to by default, as many of Ukraine's men are now fighting on the front lines. A gruesome example of this approach comes from Russia's September 9, 2025 airstrike on the small village of Yurova, which is in Ukraine's Donetsk region. That one strike happened as a large group of elderly people were traveling to collect their monthly pensions. Russia struck, killing 25 people and injuring another 18. Of those casualties, 23 were pensioners, and the age of the victims ranged between 53 and 87. This is all psychological pressure that Putin employs to amplify the physical damage caused by Russia's airstrikes. But Russia won't break Ukraine. Beyond the arrival of the new air defense missiles and Ukraine's new strategy, the people of Ukraine aren't breaking under Putin's pressure. That was demonstrated in a January 16th article by TVP World, in which the outlet carried quotes from those who are living through Russia's bombardments. The toughness of Ukraine's civilians shines through in many of these quotes, as each person questioned explains how they deal with Russian attacks cutting off their heat and electricity. 67-year-old Valentina, who lives in Bielorussia, stands out. "Well, we're not exactly living in comfort, but we somehow adapt. At least we're not hungry or filthy, and we actually sleep like babies," she says. There's tough, and then there's Valentina tough. A combination of ingenuity and steadfast dedication to their homeland is carrying Ukraine's citizens through a harsh winter. The arrival of new air defense missiles has happened just in time for Ukraine to start shutting down Russian airstrikes that would have previously done a whole lot more damage. And as Ukraine gets new missiles, Russia may be going in the opposite direction. Earlier we suggested that Russia's use of a Zircon anti-ship missile during its January 19th attack may have offered a small hint that Russia has a missile problem. That problem hasn't been confirmed yet. Russia Matters reports that there have been many claims of impending Russian missile shortages since Putin invaded. Some now appear to directly affect the types of missiles that Russia is using to attack Ukraine's cities. For instance, August brought with it claims that Russia has burned through about 80% of its Iskander stockpiles. That's huge. If Ukraine can keep destroying these missiles as they arrive, Russia will be forced to slowly rely on newly built Iskanders to carry out its attacks. So there's another bright spot to add to what we saw on January 19th. The arrival of new missiles has turned Ukraine into an air defense behemoth once more. If Ukraine has enough of those missiles to last until the end of winter, yet another of Putin's schemes will have failed. Speaking of failed Russian schemes and air defenses, Putin's plans to protect Russia's own are also falling apart. Russia has been left naked and afraid.